became, quote, community organizers, unquote, long before Barack Obama made it chic to be so. Richmond resident Margaret Starks describes this militancy, and I want to read her words. It was about survival. They weren't leaving, she's talking about the migrants. They weren't leaving, and they didn't want to be pushed around by white folks anymore, so they had to get together and fight back. Fighting back took a variety of forms, including organizing against school and housing segregation, against job discrimination, and against police brutality. By the late 1960s, as many of us know, the Black Panthers made police brutality kind of the linchpin of their appeal to African Americans in Oakland, in Black Oakland, and other communities across the nation. But as early as 1950, this pattern of discriminatory violence had become so pronounced that Oakland drew the attention of the California State Legislature, the California State Assembly. The Assembly set up a special committee to investigate what was happening in Oakland. It was called the Interim Committee on Crime and Corrections. The committee held hearings in Oakland, and they listened to hundreds of Black folks and others talk about police harassment. And I won't give you all the examples. The examples run from just being stopped all the way to people who were killed. But let me give you just one example of this. Stanley Wilson. Stanley Wilson was a fairly well-known musician in Oakland. He had unpaid traffic tickets. He went to the Oakland police station. He went there with his white wife, and he was immediately beaten by the police because he showed up with a white wife. In other words, this is the kind of violence that was routine for Black folks in Oakland at the time. Indeed, C.L. Dellums, this is the Oakland police force in 1950, or at least some of it. C.L. Dellums remarked at the time that generally Negroes regard the police as their natural enemies. And why not? According to the committee itself, the Oakland police force, and I want you to listen to this carefully, the Oakland police force refused to hire Black or white candidates who scored well on the entrance exams and instead selected white men with lesser education, quote, because they were easier to control. In other words, we're setting up a dichotomy that's going to extend well into the 1960s. African Americans had plenty of grievances, but increasingly they were going to have a lot of allies. Historian Al Broussard, sitting out there, has provided us with a lot of information about these allies. And by 1947, the Bay Area had become the major center in the nation for an interracial progressive coalition which challenged the problems facing African Americans and other people of color. Progressive, racially integrated unions were a powerful and maybe even the most powerful component of this coalition. Now, we all know about the Boilermakers. This is the Brotherhood, the Boilermaker struggle, and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was right in the middle of that struggle. This was the largest Black union in the Oakland area, but they were committed to racial justice. They were involved in almost every racial justice campaign, and of course their leader was C.L. Dellums. The Brotherhood's offices, I'm going to say this again, another example of close proximity. The Brotherhood's offices were 6 blocks from here. The Brotherhood's headquarters was 6 blocks from here. And from that headquarters, they and others like them would fan out to challenge racial discrimination throughout the area. By the end of World War II, Harry Bridges led the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union. Actually, it led them from the 1930s. That was 25% Black in the Oakland area, and they were also going to be foot soldiers in the campaign for racial justice. There was also the American Marine Cooks and Stewards Union, and that was 33% Black. They were going to be reliable allies in this emerging coalition. They created what historian Robert Self described as, quote, a cosmopolitan laborite culture that blended politics, trade unionism, and human rights, unquote. The growth of the African American population on the West Coast in the 1940s almost immediately led to significant Black political participation. A number of Black leaders emerged in the East Bay, in the East Bay area as part of the East Bay Democratic Club under the leadership, the East Bay Democratic Club under the leadership of D.G. Gibson. I wish we had more time to go into him, but he was a former railroad porter. He invested in real estate, made a lot of money, and by 1942, he realized that the migrants weren't going back home, And as a result, he organized this club that was going to be instrumental in changing the political culture of the region. Let me quote from one of the most important people to come out of the club, Willie Brown. Willie Brown, well, you know Willie Brown. Everybody here knows who Willie Brown is. Willie Brown said in 1975, D.G. Gibson may well be the political father of us all, and he meant by that all the black politicians who were active in the Bay Area. The East Bay Democratic Club helped to forge a remarkable political coalition which included progressive unions, Berkeley liberals, working class blacks in West Oakland and increasingly in North Oakland, and middle class blacks in South Berkeley. Together, they wrestled power away from conservative Republicans. I know it's hard to believe, but up until the 1940s, Berkeley was a conservative Republican bastion. And the East Bay Club and black folks in general helped to change that dynamics. In other words, they created a liberal political culture in the region, which endures to this day, as we know, right outside this building. Their activities would help to fashion a far more liberal Democratic Party in California, which in 1958 would elect Edmund G. Pat Brown, and of course you know he's the father of the current governor. The East Bay Democratic Club's first significant victory came in 1948 when Byron Rumford, a black Berkeley pharmacist, won the election to the California Assembly. He won from a predominantly white district, by the way. His election, however, was the first in a series of victories that would eventually lead to dozens of black elected officials in every major city in the Bay Area, and continuous African-American representation from the 7th Congressional District, of which we are on the border, that would start in 1970 and run right to this day. The San Francisco Bay Area, let me go both forward and backwards here. The San Francisco Bay Area offers a spectacular vantage point from which to re-examine the civil rights movement. We talked the other day, and there was, in one of the sessions, there was discussion of the long civil rights movement. This is the long civil rights movement because it goes all the way back to the 1850s. In other words, African-American political activists in the Bay Area were simultaneously fighting slavery in California. Yes, there was slavery in California. We can't get into it now. But they fought slavery in California, and they fought for the civil rights of all African Americans. I'll give you pictures of some of the leading San Francisco black abolitionists from this period. You can see their names as well. By the early 1960s, this struggle is carried forward. By the early 1960s, Bay Area activists are going to continue the fight for racial justice. Blacks, whites, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and Latinos across the region are now employing sit-ins, economic boycotts, protest marches, and other forms of nonviolent demonstration to confront what they call the 3 major grievances of the African American community: job discrimination, housing bias, and de facto school segregation. They saw their efforts as an integral part of the national campaign to eradicate racism, empower black communities, and achieve what they felt would be the full and final democratization of the United States. Although civil rights protests took place across the West, the San Francisco Bay Area became the epicenter of such protests in the region in the 1960s. And you can see from some of these images. The Bay Area, of course, had a long tradition of left labor activism, and those leftists in many instances provided the tactics, the support, and often the foot soldiers for civil rights protests. By the early 1960s, however, African Americans also had an array of issues and grievances that drove the protests, including continuing job discrimination. Let me give you some examples of this, and I think these will surprise you. West Oakland, again, starting just a few blocks from here, literally a doorstep away from the city's downtown business district, was pretty well isolated economically from downtown Oakland. As late as 1963, no African Americans worked in downtown Oakland in even the most menial capacity as janitor or cleaning women. Now, I want to repeat that, because you can go out this room, you can go out this building, and you can see black folks working in downtown Oakland everywhere. But in 1963, there were no black people working in downtown Oakland. That's how great the divide was at that time. And of course, in 1963, Oakland had an unemployment rate of, black Oakland had an unemployment rate of 25%. Berkeley was hardly better. In 1960, Berkeley's citywide unemployment rate was 3.7%. For African Americans, it was 12%. As late as 1961, downtown merchants in Berkeley refused to hire African Americans in any capacity, and there was only one black waitress in the entire city of Berkeley. Let me repeat that, one black waitress in the entire city of Berkeley. One Berkeley employer summarized the attitude of many when he said, "I'm not prejudiced, I just prefer an all-white staff." Bay Area activists, and you can see them here, beginning in 1961, would challenge this segregation in a variety of forms. They targeted San Francisco, they targeted Oakland, they targeted Richmond, they targeted Berkeley. They shifted from unemployment discrimination to housing segregation to public accommodations. They would employ organizing and protest tactics similar to those in the South. And they would also get some high-profile targets, as you're going to imagine. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the film American Graffiti, but Mel's Diner was featured in that. It was also the target of civil rights protests in 1963. There was the Lucky grocery store chain. Is Lucky still around? The Lucky grocery store chain discriminated, and blacks went after blacks, and their white supporters went after them. There were protests, to show you the size and scale of this, there were protests against over 200 businesses in downtown Oakland and Berkeley in 1962 and 1963. In other words, individual protests against over 200 businesses. And as you can see from the photograph, one of the businesses that received the protest was the Oakland Trib. And I find it very interesting to juxtapose the fact that William Nolan loves to go to black jazz clubs, and yet he doesn't hire black people at the Oakland Trib. But that's essentially part of the process that was going on at that time. Civil rights protests reached their apex in 1964 with the Sheridan Palace demonstrations led by 18-year-old Tracy Sims. She was a native of Berkeley. She was a former San Francisco State University freshman. She dropped out of school in 1963 to work full-time in the civil rights movement. When asked why she engaged in civil rights protests, Sims told the San Francisco Chronicle in 1963, quote, I inherited this fight as part of my Negro birthright, unquote. Sims and other black and white civil rights activists organized the Ad Hoc Committee to End Discrimination, which set its sights on the most prominent hotel in the Bay Area, the Sheridan Palace. The Sheridan Palace had a whites-only policy in terms of hiring, which again is sort of ironic because the first people who worked for the Sheridan Palace, or the Palace, the old Palace Hotel, when it was opened in 1875, were black folks. But eventually the black folks were pushed out. Eventually they had the all-white policy, and that would continue at least until the 1960s. In February 1964, the committee began its demonstrations against the Sheridan Palace. Picketing began on a small scale, but it escalated when 123 demonstrators were arrested. On March 6, 1964, approximately 1,500 demonstrators, and you can see some of them here, 1,500 demonstrators ranging from working class black youth to UC Berkeley professors walked the picket lines outside while hundreds of others filled the lobby, the hotel lobby. Eventually, 167 demonstrators were arrested, that is, went to jail, including an interesting young man named Mario Savio, who eventually became the leader of the Berkeley free speech movement. Ultimately, San Francisco Mayor John G. Shelley mediated an agreement between Sims, again, Sims, 18 years old, between Sims and the Sheridan Palace Hotel, which would become binding on all of the city's hotels. That agreement ended the racially exclusive hiring policies of the city's hotel. I want you to think about this for a minute. We see people of color all over this place, but we wouldn't have seen this in 1963, 1962, or even part of 1964 had it not been for Sims and other demonstrators who took this on. 4 months after the stunning victory at the Sheridan Palace Hotel, President Lyndon Johnson signs the 1964 Civil Rights Act. With that signing, much of the nation believed that the century-long struggle for racial justice was finally over. They were wrong. They were wrong, and they were particularly wrong in the case of Oakland. In 13 months, or 13 months after that signing, Watts would explode, and within 2 years, the entire national discourse would be about Black power. For Oakland and the East Bay, the decades-old struggle for housing and jobs continued as new leaders realized that the heroic marches and the multicultural demonstrations ultimately proved no match for structural changes that were broadly and silently undermining the very gains promised by the civil rights movement. Oakland in the 1960s became poorer and blacker. First, there was urban renewal, which began slowly in the 1950s, and it systematically removed much of the housing stock of West Oakland. I'll explain this in a minute. The residents of the area had long called for the city government to go after the slum landlords, whose properties brought down the values of surrounding houses maintained by working class families, proudly maintained by working class families. I'm going to interject this. This is Lola Bell Sims. She wrote a letter to President Harry Truman in 1949 in which she's begging him, she's imploring him to go discreetly, to not tear down all the houses, to not condemn entire areas, and to not cost her home. To not cause her to lose her home. Unfortunately, what she got and what most of West Oakland got was urban renewal. And urban renewal effectively designated all of West Oakland as a blighted area and set to remove as much of that as possible. The impact of urban renewal was compounded by the decision by city leaders, and actually state leaders, to build the Cypress Freeway in West Oakland and the Bay Area Rapid Transit, which ran above ground along 7th Avenue in the heart of the city. You can see the swath that's created by the freeway construction. And I don't know how many of you have gone to San Francisco, but if you've gone to San Francisco, you've ridden on BART and you've ridden down 7th Avenue. To be sure, urban renewal schemes and transportation projects like the freeway and like BART disrupt neighborhoods everywhere, not everywhere across Oakland and in cities around the country. White residents, however, usually had the means to start anew somewhere else in the city or in the suburbs. Black residents did not. To make matters worse, the city refused to build public housing to accommodate those who were renters. Between 1960 and 1966 alone, more than 7,000 housing units in Oakland were destroyed by BART and by the freeway construction and by urban renewal, and the city replaced only 500 units. What that means, folks, is that by 1963, 1964, 14,000 people in West Oakland were displaced. 14,000 people were made, at least temporarily, homeless. To make the situation worse, the declining job base would hurt Oaklanders, or East Bay blacks, even more so. Now think back to the geography of the East Bay in the 1880s and 1890s. Black folks lived close to the railroads because of the Pullman Car Company and also because of the work in the railroad shops and beyond. By the 1960s, the Pullman Car Company no longer existed, and there was automation of the railroads, and so there were far fewer workers who were needed. Moreover, the situation is compounded by the changes taking place at the Port of Oakland. The Port of Oakland had been an employer of literally thousands of workers for years and years. Then it becomes automated, and in 1968, when its facility is opened, the port could handle 80% more traffic with about a fifth of the workers that it employed before. Oakland was also the first California city to de-industrialize. In the late 1980s, we all as academics, or many of us as academics in urban history, heard about deindustrialization, and of course the American public heard about it as well. As the once great industrial powerhouses, Detroit, St. Louis, Cleveland, you can name them, they lost hundreds of thousands of jobs. As Thomas Segru and Robert Self, is Robert Self here? Is Robert here? Okay, as Robert Self and Thomas Segru have argued for Detroit and for Oakland, and what everybody would notice long later was that this is a process that began not in the 1980s, not in the 1970s, but in the period just before World War II. In other words, decisions were made, discussions were ran, committees were established that would have a powerful effect on the future of Oakland and a whole host of black communities across the country. Let me give you the quick story of Oakland. I know we're running out of time. By the mid-1930s, the Oakland Chamber of Commerce created the Metropolitan Oakland Area Program, or MOPE, with the idea of encouraging industry that was to be relocated in the countryside. And Oakland saw itself as kind of the center of this regional urban area, with all of the suburban people coming into the city to buy products, and Oakland's downtown would prosper. And of course, in order to do this, a little bit later, they pushed BART. They promoted BART. What they didn't realize, and what you guys already know, is that if you get on BART in downtown Oakland, you're in San Francisco in how many minutes? 12 minutes. 12 minutes. And so people from the suburban areas of Oakland decided, why should we stop in downtown Oakland when we can go to San Francisco in another 15 minutes? And so the city fathers who hoped that BART would help them actually came to realize, although too late, that BART was actually siphoning customers and trade from Oakland, from downtown Oakland, into San Francisco. Between 1958, to make matters worse, between 1958 and 1966, Oakland lost over 9,000 industrial jobs. The largest plant to move, and I'll do this very quickly, is the Fremont General Motors plant that moved to Fremont 30 miles south. 2 years after its relocation, it had 5,400 workers. Soon, white workers followed industry to the suburbs, such as San Leandro, Newark, Union City, and Fremont. Black workers could not go to the suburbs. Throughout the 1960s, the Southern Alameda County Real Estate Board, this is the board that handled all real estate transactions south of the city limits of Oakland, refused to refer its real estate sales or real estate offerings to people, either to realtors, either black or white, in the city of Oakland. In other words, a divide was being created. I want you to read the words. This is part of the testimony from the U.S. Civil Rights Commission meeting in Oakland in 1967. I won't say anything. The words speak for themselves. Suburban residential apartheid quickly emerged. San Leandro, and that's the city immediately south of Oakland, had 68,000. Let me pull this. Have you all read this? Okay. And I know it's hard to see this, but look at San Leandro. In 1970, it had 68,000 people, 84 were black. Statistically, that meant the San Leandro was 99.9% white. Okay? And you can look at those figures and you can see what's going on. What this means then is that there is a kind of regional apartheid taking place. In other words, black people are living in the cities, or more specifically the city of Oakland, and whites are living outside, and that's where, to a large extent, the jobs are going to be. And there were numerous reports that pointed this out. It's not that black people lost skills, it's that black people lost the ability to get to where the jobs were, because the jobs were increasingly going to the suburbs where African Americans could not live. It is in this context, the context of the loss of jobs, the growing physical isolation of black Oakland and communities across the nation, and the failure of liberal reform as represented by the Civil Rights Movement, that the Black Panther Party can best be understood. The Panthers were also part of a long tradition of racial protest here in Oakland. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was founded in North Oakland on October 15, 1966. Folks, that is exactly 45 years ago today. So there's a birthday for the Panthers. Its founders, Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, were like so many sons and daughters of World War II migrants, unable to find a place in the increasingly post-industrial society of Oakland. Newton was 25 years old, he was marginally employed, he was a parolee. Seale was 29, he was cycling between day jobs while trying to earn a living as a nightclub comedian. They met in 1961 at Oakland City College, drawn together by their mutual admiration of Malcolm X, Street Brothers, and socialist theories. The Panthers' founding document, the 10-point program, What We Want, What We Believe, has often been dismissed as overblown rhetoric of young militants. who were seeking attention in the world of Black power advocates. Yet with their demands for full employment for our people, decent housing, and an end to the robbery by the capitalists of our community, they were literally channeling virtually every prior campaign by Bay Area activists over the last 4 decades. Every eviction, every plant closure, every relocation they were addressing in their rhetoric. Underlying that Marxist rhetoric and the brandished guns and the black leather jackets lay their unique response to the increasing isolation and alienation of Black Oakland. Using the long corridor between West Oakland and North Oakland and South Berkeley and eventually the University of California campus, the Panthers placed themselves in an intellectual and social milieu that brought together the aging left activists, Union veterans of the dock wars of the 1930s and 1940s, and the rapidly evolving student and anti-war movements of the 1960s. You can see here, they're drawing together hundreds of people. They're drawing together the sons of university, the sons and daughters of university professors, and the sons and daughters of migrant workers. The Panthers initially called for a radical transformation of Black Oakland, deeming it an internal colony of the United States. And they demanded autonomy, and they called for the removal of the police as an occupying army. Eventually, however, they moved to what would be known as survival programs: free health clinics, free food distribution, free screening for sickle cell anemia, and a Panther after-school program for children. Their free breakfast program, as many of you know, would eventually become today's federal school lunch program that many people have benefited from. Ironically, it was J. Edgar Hoover, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's fear of the impact of these survival programs that was more dangerous to him than the Panthers' confrontations with the police. In other words, J. Edgar Hoover understood that these programs could actually marshal a great deal of support for the Panthers throughout Black America, and it's at that moment that he declares that the Black Panther Party is, quote, the single greatest threat to the internal security of the United States. The Panthers' greatest success came in 1973. I know we're running out of time. I'll go a little bit faster. The Panthers' greatest success came in 1973 when they mobilized thousands of new voters, about 35,000 new voters in Oakland, and they put forward 2 candidates, Bobby Seale and Elaine Brown. Some of you may even remember the campaign. You may not remember the platform. This is what the Panthers ran on: capital gains tax of 5% on the sale or transfer of all income property in Oakland, including corporate property, tax of 1% on stocks and bonds, increased revenue fees for the Oakland Coliseum and the golf course, and the Oakland Convention Center, so we would have been paying more money, and residency requirements for the police and firefighters, because ironically, most police and firefighters in Oakland lived outside of Oakland, and thus they didn't pay any taxes in Oakland. Ultimately though, the Panthers campaign was going to be rejected. Seale and Brown ran spirited campaigns, but they lost as Oakland voters turned out in record numbers to reject their radical agenda. 4 years later, 4 years after the defeat of the Panthers, though, the city's political landscape changed dramatically as Judge Lionel Wilson fashioned a broad coalition that included the Panthers, white liberals, and labor unions, and he easily defeated conservative white businessman David Tucker. While many credited or blamed the Panthers for that victory, the roots of the changing political landscape in Oakland, as well as Berkeley and Richmond, go back long before the founding of the party in 1966. Between 1960 and 1970, 56,000 whites left Oakland. They represented 20% of the white population. Their departure opened housing for middle-class African Americans and a growing number of Asians and Chicano newcomers. Oakland's Black middle class expanded dramatically from the 1960s through the 1990s, also as anti-discrimination policies at the federal and state and local level provided work opportunities that were closed to the private sector. In other words, Black folks began to work at the Alameda Naval Air Station, the Oakland Army Base, Oak Knoll Naval Hospital, and on and on and on. Indeed, by 1975, 30% of the jobs that Black Oaklanders had came from various government agencies. Middle-class Blacks in all of these cities began to move into previously white neighborhoods in Oakland, Berkeley, and Richmond, and after 1980 into the suburbs themselves. And in fact, the Black populations of Berkeley and Richmond peaked in the 1980s, and in Oakland, they peaked in the 1990s. The newest immigrants, the newest people to arrive, were Latinos and Asians. And of course, they would face their very own urban frontier in the 1970s and the 1980s. Nonetheless, for 22 years, two black Oakland mayors, Lionel Wilson and Elihu Harris, led the city and determined its political priorities. Wilson began his term by appointing African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans to the port and planning and civil service commissions, and he was helped in 1980 by a charter amendment that led to voting for council positions in district elections rather than at large. Within 3 years, black candidates won 5 of the 9 council seats. Wilson also instituted a citizens review board for the Oakland Police, and which finally responded to 4 decades of demands for oversight of the police force. And as you can see, I won't go into this detail, but you can see how the Oakland Police would change. By 1990, 30% of the policemen in Oakland would be African American, and the percentages are even larger now. The black middle class was the primary beneficiary of these changes. From 1970 to 1990, the number of African American professionals doubled from 11% to 23% of the black employed. Indeed, by 1983, Mayor Wilson operated with a black majority on the city council and the school board, and black professionals served as city manager, city attorney, city clerk, city planning director, and director of economic development for Oakland. Oakland now compared itself to Atlanta as the Mecca for African American professionals from all over the country. The most symbolic of these changes, getting ahead of myself. The most symbolic of these changes was Robert Maynard's purchase of the Oakland Tribune. Now I want you to think about it for a minute. The Oakland Tribune had been one of the most conservative newspapers in the country for the longest time, and now it's owned by an African American. Maynard would control the paper until his death in 1993. But while there were changes, and the changes encouraged the black middle class, there were other changes that led to increasing difficulty for Oakland. Between 1970 and 1990, Oakland lost another 90,000 white residents. Factories continued to close, and they moved away, and now the destination was not just the southern part of Alameda County, it was the US South, it was Mexico, it was Asia. Oakland's central business district became the poster child for economic decline in the 1970s and the 1980s. Perhaps the greatest symbol of Oakland's declining fortunes was the 1982 decision by Al Davis, and some of you are old enough to remember this, by Al Davis to remove the Raiders to Los Angeles. These demographic and economic changes forced Mayor Wilson and his successor to abandon plans for industrial development. They in turn began to focus on luring investment to the city through tourism, retail trade, and corporate administration. Or this is the Jack London Square. We've all visited it. This is what the city of Oakland had to do. The Jack London Square, the Victorian Row, which some of you I hope have seen, and the Convention Center, which we're in right now. All of these are attempts to try to deal with the fact that Oakland had lost its industrial base. Despite such gains, most of black Oakland continues to ask the question, what happens to a working class when there's no longer any work? Let me repeat that. What happens to a working class when there's no longer any work? As the U.S. grapples with the greatest economic downturn since the Great Depression, and thousands of people protest across the country and outside our hotel in a movement called Occupy Wall Street, you know that this question has profound implications, not just for black Oakland, but for all of America. And that's the lesson, folks. That's the lesson of Oakland, that Oakland indeed is not just West Oakland undergoing severe economic change and decline. It's West Oakland being the canary in the coal mine. And that's one of the things that we're going to have to deal with in during the rest of this next century. Thank you very much. I apologize for running long. Thank you. Thank you. next session. I guess I'm supposed to say that. Feel free to go to the next session.
This past July 4th, in a ceremony held aboard the USS Constitution in Boston Harbor, Simon Winchester, author of The Professor and the Madman and Krakatoa, became an American citizen.
I decided that